Imagine for a second you are a Russian technician in 1962 and you have just received the first broadcast from a Venus lander. But what you see is blue sky, clouds, creatures flying through the sky. Because in this universe, Venus is habitable. It's not just habitable, it's habited. And not just by one human race, but two. Modern humans and Neanderthals. This is the universe of the Lords of Creation. Not to be confused with the Lords of Uncreation. This is the trilogy by S.M. Stirling. What I described to you is essentially the opening scene of the first book in the series, The Sky People, followed by the short story The Swords of Sartikhan, the second book, In the Courts of the Crimson King, and then the third book, The Lords of Creation. The reason this book is so interesting is that a lot of very old sci-fi, before the Vanera landers and the Viking landers to Mars, the people had the assumption that the other planets were habitable. In fact, most people are aware that Mars was thought to have canals, and so people had this idea that it was a desert world and they would channel the water and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of fiction from before the space race was about this kind of thing. But it turns out that Venus had the same thing, but it was the idea that it was swampy. And so, but still habitable. So you had lots of frog people and that kind of stuff. But the thing that's really interesting is that The Sky People was not written in the 40s or the 30s. It was written in 2005, and it's a modern spin on this old classic style of science fiction, and it's interesting for kind of a few specific reasons. So obviously a lot of this older sci-fi did not have a good understanding of actual spaceflight because they were guessing. So for example, the Barsoom series, starting with A Princess of Mars, didn't really have a spaceship. He just kind of teleports to the other planets. And it sort of said that he learns how to do this himself, but it doesn't really have a spacecraft. You don't have a spacecraft like that isn't essentially a boat until sort of the Skylark of space. So the Lords of Creation follows a much more modern understanding of what's capable, what's possible in spaceflight. And it also has the advantage of retroactively looking back at the technology that we had previously. So you don't have big spacecraft. Obviously, this happens in the middle of the Cold War, and in the real world, the Cold War became the space race. The Cold War was fought with milestones in space, and in a similar vein, the Cold War becomes the space race, but it's who can get the most of the natives on their side. So on Venus there are dinosaurs basically, and so there isn't really a major civilization because you put too many people in one place and they all get eaten. Mars is a very different story. The race on Mars is 200 million years old, and they're very dissimilar to the humans that are on Venus. The humans on Venus speak Proto-Indo-European, so they're only about 12,000 years diverged from us. But it seems that something happened, and throughout the books you slowly work towards what happened, and this culminates in the third book, the end of the second book, where they discover a computer system hidden under Mars that is essentially a monitoring program about 200 million years in the past, something came through the solar system and it terraformed Venus and Mars. And then every now and again, something from Earth has ended up on one of the other planets. So that's why there are dinosaurs. That's why there are humans, only 12,000 years diverged. And so you sort of have this big mystery. But I find it interesting because there's a very modern take on why is there life on a planet that shouldn't have it. Well, the idea is obviously then we have the idea that we can terraform these planets, but it's way, way beyond our ability of current technology. Like, we could do it, but it would take so long that we'd have reinvented the technology several times by the time we get done with it. So it's a way to do sort of, I don't know if Sterling, who's the author here, started with that principle or worked back through it. But I think it's a very interesting way to sort of ancient aliens plus humans on other planets and that kind of stuff. And this is something that has precedent in other media as well. So there are other couple of differences between sort of the classic era of sci-fi. So this sort of classic era I'm referring to is often referred to as planetary romance. And obviously Princess of Mars is the cornerstone example of this. John Carter gets sent from Earth to Mars, falls in love with a Martian princess, wins a battle. Planetary romance. Like, it's very simple. This is different. So in the Sky People, there is a romance. All these the first two books do have a romance plot to them. But this first one is kind of standard. Earth male, local woman. It's more interesting because it's played off differently. And in The Courts of the Crimson King, there's an inversion where sort of the Earth, the humans are not really pushing it. They're not very active in this. There's a lot more. The locals have a lot more autonomy to do what they want, which I think is an interesting take on sort of a post-colonial, perhaps, kind of opinion on native people. I'm not really going to say any more about this trilogy because it's quite interesting within itself. If you'd like a taster, there's a short story in a book series called Old Mars, which is called The Swords of Zartikan that I mentioned before. And it'll give you a good idea. It's a little short story it's set on Mars. It gives you a little bit of an idea of the kind of culture that it's working with. But yes, so I would definitely recommend the Laws of Creation trilogy. Again, it's quite unfortunate. He published the third book about a day after another large author published his book called The Laws of Uncreation. So presumably it got completely tanked because I saw people talking about the other one instead, which is a shame. But yeah, that's kind of the risk you run.